Welcome to this lesson on understanding the supply chain. This lesson provides an introduction to the supply chain concept and its importance in underpinning customer relations management processes and systems in the organization. In this lesson, we will consider the evolution of the supply chain concept and consider how we can set about creating a customer-focused approach to the management of the supply chain in the organization. One can hardly find any aspect of business that has nothing to do with supply chain management. Take an example of quality management and ask yourself a question. Can you manage and improve the quality standard of your product or service, measured by the end consumer, without managing the suppliers and buyers in the supply chain at all? Of course not. Business value creation is always a collective contribution from the whole supply chain. Managers increasingly recognize that their businesses are only part of the supply chains that they participate in, and it is the supply chain that wins or loses the competition. The survival of any business today is no longer solely dependent on its own ability to compete, but rather on the ability to cooperate within the supply chain. The seemingly independent relation between the organizations within the supply chain becomes ever more interdependent. You sink or swim with the supply chain. It is for this reason we need to actively manage the supply chain across the organization. Business value creation is always a collective contribution from the whole supply chain. Managers increasingly recognize that their businesses are only part of the supply chains that they participate in, and it is the supply chain that wins or loses the competition. The survival of any business today is no longer solely dependent on its own ability to compete, but rather on the ability to cooperate within the supply chain. The relations between organizations within the supply chain are becoming ever more interdependent, and it is for this reason we need to actively manage the supply chain across the organization. There are many different definitions of supply chains. In this course, we suggest using the definition below. A supply chain is defined as a group of interconnected participating companies that add value to a stream of transformed inputs from their source of origin to the end products or services that are demanded by the designated end consumers. So, what are the key characteristics of a supply chain? First, a supply chain is formed and can only be formed if there are more than one participating company. Second, the participating companies within a supply chain normally do not belong to the same business ownership, and hence there is a legal independence in between. Third, those companies are interconnected on the common commitment to add value to the stream of material flow that run through the supply chain. This material flow, to each company, comes in as the transformed inputs and goes out as the value-added outputs. In a supply chain, the links are the participating companies that are interconnected in the value-adding process. The link on the upstream side of the material flow is the supplier's supplier, and on the downstream side of the material flow is the consumer. There is usually an OEM, or original equipment manufacturer, in between. At the end of a supply chain is the products or services that are created by the supply chain for the end consumer. Therefore, the fundamental reason for a supply chain's existence is to serve the end consumer in the marketplace. The degree of how well a supply chain can serve their consumers ultimately defines its competitive edge in the marketplace. It is understandable that in the real world, a supply chain is much more complex than the one depicted in this image. It is not really a chain, rather it is more like a network, when you consider that there are usually multiple suppliers and multiple customers for each of the participating companies in the chain. There are also possible nested chains within the chains. For example, an engine manufacturing supply chain is a nested supply chain within the connected automobile supply chain. Given this level of complexity, we might ask, where does a supply chain start and end? In order to answer this question, we need to understand the three intrinsic flows of a supply chain. These are the product flow, the informational flow, and the finance, or commercial flow. Let's look at each of these in turn. All manufacturing supply chains have product flows, from the raw materials at the beginning of the supply chain to the finished products at the end of the supply chain. Our furniture-making supply chain will have the wood cut down from the forest at the beginning of its supply chain, and home furniture at the end of supply chain. The continuous flow of wood being transformed through the chain, and end up as furniture, ties the whole supply chain together and defines its clear boundaries. All supply chains have and make use of information flows. Throughout a supply chain, there are a multitude of information flows, such as demand information flow, forecasting information flow, production and scheduling information flows, and design and new product information flows. Unlike the material flow, the information can run both directions, towards upstream and downstream alike. Interestingly, most of them are unique to the specific supply chain. Finally, all supply chains have a financial, or a commercial flow. This means that the material flow that runs through the supply chain changes its ownership from one company to another, from supplier to buyer. The transactional process of buying and selling shifts the material flow's ownership from the supplier to the buyer repeatedly, until the end of the supply chain, the end consumer. This transactional commercial flow will only take place in a supply chain, where there are more than one companies. On the other hand, if it is within an organization, there will be material flow, but no ownership change, and therefore, no commercial flow. But there will likely still be a financial flow. As a business owner, or manager, we can see that the management of information flow, material flow and financial flow, are vital to ensure customer satisfaction and commercial success. The end consumer to a supply chain is perhaps the most important factor of all, as far as its management is concerned. Everything a supply chain does is driven by the needs and wants of the end consumer. The contents of supply chain management are populated with the approaches, activities as well as strategies that are aiming at delivering the products and services to satisfy the end consumer. Therefore, it is safe to say that the supply chain management should be customer-centered. This reflects the typical characteristic of supply chain's customer orientation. Here is our working definition of supply chain management. Supply chain management is the planning, scheduling and control of the supply chain, which is the sequence of organizations and functions that mine, make or assemble materials and products, from manufacturer to wholesaler to retailer to consumer. Any supply chain management practice and activities is captured by the following three conceptual components. Supply chain configuration, the supply chain relationship, and supply chain coordination. Supply chain configuration is about how a supply chain is constructed, from all its participating firms. This includes answering the following questions. How big is the supply base for the original equipment manufacturer? How wide or narrow is the extent of vertical integration in the supply chain? That is the extent of single ownership of consecutive activities along the supply chain. How much of the OEM's operations are outsourced? And how the downstream distribution channel is designed, and so on. The decisions on supply chain configuration, or architecture as it also known, is a strategic one, often determined outside the control of most operational managers. The supply chain relationships are about inter-firm relationships across the supply chain. The key focus of these relationships is often around the OEM and its first-tier suppliers, and first-tier customers, and the relationships in between. The type and level of the relationships is determined by the nature of the inter-organizational exchanges. The relationship is likely to be arm's length, if each party only exchanged the volume and the prices of the transaction. On the other hand, the relationship would be regarded as a close partnership if the parties exchanged their vision, investment planning, processes, and detailed financial information. Therefore, the decision on the nature of supply chain relationship is both strategic and operational. Supply chain coordination refers mainly to the inter-firm operational coordination within a supply chain. It involves the coordination of continuous material flows, from the suppliers to the buyers, and through to the end consumer, in a preferably just-in-time management manner. Inventory management throughout the supply chain could be a key focal point for this coordination. Production capacity, forecasting, manufacturing scheduling, and importantly customer services, will all constitute the main contents of the coordination activities in the supply chain. The decision on the extent of supply chain coordination tends to be operational. Recent trends in supply chains include a movement from a functional to a process perspective on the business. A movement from an operational to strategic viewpoint of the value chain. A movement from a transactional to relationship-based engagement between participants in the supply chain. And, finally, a transition from local to regional, and from regional to global supplier and customer relationships. Business management used to see and take action on the functional silos in the business. In a functional structure, supply was considered as the delivery part of the business. However, in successful businesses today, the supply chain concept is central to management decision-making and underpins value generation. In the early years of supply chain management, senior managers tended to see it as another operational issue that would help to reduce operational costs, such as in improving the purchasing and logistics functions. Gradually, it has become more widely accepted that operational improvements can be better addressed from a supply chain-wide perspective. Enterprise management is now arguably becoming displaced by supply chain management, where the supply chain is by definition the extended enterprise. And most importantly, companies are increasingly aware of the need to establish close working relationships across the supply chain in order to build a competitive edge. Business engagement between firms in the past was predominantly transaction-based and cost-driven. The merit of any purchasing and procurement of externally sourced materials and services was judged by the transactional measures of price, volume and delivery terms. Today, relations with external organizations within the supply chain are becoming increasingly relationship-based. This relationship approach does not abandon efficient management of transactional activities, but places more emphasis on knowledge exchange, long-term commitments, and relationship incentives and reward. The third major shift in management of the supply chain has been the transition from local to regional, and from regional to global relationships. Connections in the supply network over the last 2 decades have grown from local to regional and from regional to global. Hardly any major enterprise and supply chain today is not connected to some part of the world. This trend is underpinned by the lower cost of labor and materials in many parts of the world, as well as first-mover advantages in setting up a global market presence. A strategic approach to the management of the supply chain is required today, if a business is to realize its true competitive potential. Understanding the supply chain is vital for all managers in a business, and can enable managers to identify opportunities to both grow customer satisfaction and improve the company's competitive position. In the lessons which follow in this course, we will examine supply chain management in detail, and how you can apply this knowledge to improve customer satisfaction and retention, and deliver enhanced value to all key stakeholders in the organization.
Want to learn more about this subject? Then click on our website to view the full course. Why not subscribe and get access to free articles and special offers? Join the Global Career Highway now.